Hey everyone, my name is Ellis and I like to wet my plants. I recently came across this Instagram account called the SydneyPlantGuy, and he has these most amazing moss poles. I was never really enthusiastic about moss poles until I saw his account, and of course when I see something cool I get obsessed about it. So I went straight ahead to the hardware store, bought the supplies that I needed, and I made some moss poles. And I wanted to show you my moss poles and show you how I made them. The moss poles are really beneficial for plants that like to climb. You're able to get much bigger foliage from a lot of your plants that climb. Some plants like the Monstera deliciosa, they just take over your place if you don't put them on a moss poles or stake them up on something. And other plants simply just produce way cooler foliage as it grows bigger. For example, philodendrons, the more mature foliage is often drastically different than the foliage of the more juvenile plants. Let's take a look at my moss poles. Hello, Heimdall. Do you want to say hello? Do you want to say hello to the people? Not very enthusiastic about this, are you? So I installed the self-watering moss pole on my Philodendron pedatum, and the idea here is to get the nodules where the aerial roots come out of to attach themselves to the moss pole. Because you are able to keep the moss damp, it will act as an encouragement for the aerial roots to attach themselves, or the nodules will simply root into the moss, in between the gauges here, or the holes, or whatever you call them. So you can see on top here that there is a twine and the PVC pipe, so you're able to simply just add the water here. I find that it does work, but you have to refill it pretty consistently to have the moss soak up all the moisture, and some of it actually just ends up being absorbed by the twine, and then it just drips through the container, and the moss takes a while to absorb the water if it's not wet. I actually just mist daily where the nodules are to make sure that it's always humid around the nodules, so the plant knows that it should attach itself there. Then I had made another moss pole using the gutter guard and a PVC pipe for my Monstera deliciosa, but this one does not have a twine in it, so it's not a self-watering one. And then for my Philodendron histatum, that's just a stake with a moss wrapped around it and a fish line. And that moss doesn't really retain a lot of moisture, so it's really hard to keep it humid, so I don't recommend it. It was just a makeshift one to keep the plant upright. And it's having a little baby. And then here is the moss pole I made using the SydneyPlantGuy method. I have put in 3 well-rooted Monstera adansonii cuttings, because here's the other thing. It is best to start very early when you're staking your plants, because as the plant grows and forms new nodules, it's much more likely to attach itself instantly. It's really hard to get formed or matured nodes to actually attach themselves to the pole or in the moss. These these nodules or aerial roots are most likely to just turn into terrestrial roots and stick themselves into the soil to provide additional support. So I would say that I like this moss pole the best, and I will be making more of these. I do, however, really like the look of the black netting. I actually think it looks pretty cool. As you can see, it's a tiny plant with big dreams. Here's a little update on my adansonii and its climbing moss wall. So speaking of how the nodules and the aerial roots decide to attach themselves, everywhere where is a new growth from when I put it in here, those nodules have rooted themselves instantly into the moss, while the older ones are actually just still hanging out and not doing anything. And then I think this little leaf is old and dying. And whoop, here are the new babies that I've added in here to fill up the space. So here we go. Farty Pants. Mr. Farty Pants. I'm gonna be showing you how I made 2 of my moss poles, and I'll explain along the way what I did and what I'm doing, because I trimmed the video of me making them and sped it up a little bit. So I hope you can see properly what I'm doing. So since the moss doesn't have any nutrients in it, I put some liquid plant food into the moss, and I used Schultz liquid plant food as I wet the moss and prep it and make it ready. It's really dry when you get it from the bale, and it might take a while for it to soak up and get it really damp. So I also just massaged the moss to get all the moisture in there. I used a 3/4 PVC pipe and then picked a twine that can soak up some water, threaded it through the pipe, secured it at one end with the elastic band. That would be the bottom of the pole, and then I just wrapped it around the pole all the way down to where the moss would eventually end, and then I left a gap at the end of the pole that I stick into the soil. I secured that end with a zip tie because I wanted to be a little bit more secure. I should probably have gone a little bit higher with the thread because the water wicks all the way through the twine and the excess water ends up getting into the pot. And then I found this gutter guard. I feel like it's the perfect width. I found it at the dollar store, cut it to where the twine ends. As I said, if I would do this one again, I would have the twine end a little higher. And then I just kind of put as much moss as I felt like I needed. You kind of have to gauge for yourself how much moss you're gonna use. You don't want it to be too little moss because then the water will just flood right through it. But then you also don't want it to be too dense, because when the moss is too dense, it actually doesn't hold on to as much moisture. I secured a few areas with zip ties, but I didn't want to use zip ties all the way through because it's kind of wasteful. It's a lot of plastic. So I just found a gardening wire that was easy to thread through the net, and that gave also the pole a really neat finish. I measured the length of the wire about 2 times the height of the pole. I could have used even a little bit less. I didn't even need that much. And then when I was done threading it all the way through, I just cleaned up the end. I packed some moss on each end to just make sure it was all firm. The hardware store had these PVC pipe stoppers or end caps, I guess, and put that one on the end. It's pretty secure. The water doesn't seem to leak through it. I think the self-watering pole, it's great to in between water the pole and kind of use as moisture maintenance. But at the end of the day, I think you will have to water it properly. So with the SydneyPlantGuy style moss pole that I made, I couldn't find PVC covered wire mesh. So instead I'm using galvanized wire mesh because you don't want the wire mesh to rust. I counted about 15 squares because that gave me the perfect girth of a pole that I wanted. And I cut the wires in a way that it would leave a long end of a wire on one side and then a flat, no excess wire on the squares on the other side. And then I used those ends, as you can see there, to wrap around on the other side to close off the pole that way. The wire is really stiff, so just note that. And I ended putting the moss about the height of the pot that I was going to use, or a similar size pot that I was going to use. I used pliers to secure the ends together so it was properly closed off. And as I said, the wire mesh is really stiff. So after I had closed up each end using the excess wire, I kind of formed the pole back into a proper pole shape with my hands. I would highly recommend using perhaps thick gloves to do this part. What I really like about this pole also is that once it dries out, you just give it a good spritz, good shower to pre-soak it, and then you can water it from the top. And then you can use the bottom part that is empty to fill up with your perfect aeroid medium. If you have any more questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll get to all of them. And please make sure to subscribe and follow my Instagram. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.